what I will present today is actually a particular way that I tried to instantiate into the physical world what I consider to be one of the most interesting and fascinating aspects of blockchain technologies, which is the ability to operate autonomously and to some extent to interact with its own environment like an independent entity with a life on its own. But before we begin, let's try and look at what are the fundamental characteristics of a blockchain that actually differentiate it from the more traditional internet-based platforms. And so, in order to do that, we can go back in 1996 when John Perry Barlow wrote the Declaration of Independence of the Cyberspace. And what Barlow wrote in this declaration actually inspired a lot of people. And what he claimed was that the cyberspace is this independent space that simply could not be regulated because governments simply do not have the right nor the capacity to exert their sovereignty over this. But then, of course, as we all know by now, those promises did not actually materialize in the same way as many of us would have hoped. Because as soon as the opportunities of the internet began to be understood by new and established market players, then the market dynamics actually kicked in, and the architecture of the internet slowly started to change, evolving into this increasingly centralized system, which is today controlled by a few incumbents. And so in just a few years, the internet, which was originally seen as this mean in order to promote individual freedoms and autonomy, has eventually have turned into this powerful tool of surveillance and control. But the reality is that John Perry Barlow actually did not believe what he had written. And in fact, to the contrary, it was the foresight that the cyberspace will soon be co-opted by corporations and by governmental powers that actually motivated him to write this declaration. And his goal was, in fact, to create a movement of digital activists that will actually stand up and fight for those newfound digital liberties. And so I was myself also very inspired by John Perry Barlow, although it wasn't the Declaration of Independence of the cyberspace that actually hooked me up. And it was a previous piece, a piece which is perhaps less known, but yet this is the one that actually made me realize how important and how powerful the internet is and why we should actually try and preserve it as much as we can. And so this piece was called Selling Wine Without Bottles. And in this piece, Barlow described how digital technology is progressively detaching information from the physical plane. So it is taking the wine out of the bottles. And without those physical containers, then there is no longer any property to trade. And so the wine can flow freely without any constraints. And so in order to contain it, then we have created those artificial bottles, what we call intellectual property, in order to create some kind of artificial scarcity over these non-rival resources like information. And so Barlow actually saw this as an omen that we actually need to rethink our existing laws and economic models, and that we need to try and get out of this scarcity-based mindset of copyright law and adopt instead a whole new mindset, one where the value actually emerges from the relationship and from the social interactions rather than from the sale of those physical containers. And so what is happening today, in my view, sorry, that's not him. What is happening today, if we listen to the early promises of Satoshi Nakamoto or the cypherpunks or many crypto-anarchists or libertarians, is that blockchain technologies is now bringing a new wave of disruption, a technological innovation that could actually help us transition towards this new decentralized society and bringing back the same ideals of freedom and autonomy which are reminiscent of the early internet days. And so the question then is, can blockchain technologies today actually succeed where the internet had failed? Now, the thing is that those narratives of decentralization, autonomy, trustlessness, or illegality are actually somewhat too similar to the early narratives that the internet pioneers were advocating for. And they may, of course, as well be just as wrong. And so it is therefore important to try and understand what is it that actually made the internet fail. And so as lawyers, over the internet, we have this notion of lex informatica, which essentially means that code is increasingly being used as a means to regulate behavior. And so code is law because code is increasingly assuming the same functionalities as the law. Even though, of course, this code remains under the control of online operators, which are themselves remaining under the traditional rule of the law. And then on a blockchain, the code is also being used as a means to regulate behavior. But the difference is that this time, because of the specificity and the inherent characteristics of the blockchain, then this code can be designed to somewhat ignore the traditional rule of law. And so the only law that actually matters in the system is the code. And so this has two important implications. One is that blockchain technologies actually reduce the need for intermediaries or trusted authority because it's actually shifting the trust away from the centralized operators and towards the underlying technology. And so this means that as long as we can trust the technology, then we no longer need to trust anyone else. And the other one is that it actually creates new possibilities for increasing the autonomy and the automation of those technological systems, because once they have been deployed on a blockchain, then the system no longer need nor heed their creators, and they can be designed to operate autonomously and independently of the original will of the parties deploying it. And so this obviously creates some potential conflicts between the rule of law and the rule of code. And so what we will explore now is what is the interplay between those two types of regulation, regulation by code and regulation by law. And can one actually overtake the other? So can blockchain technologies be actually forced to comply with the law, or to the contrary, can they actually be used in order to bypass existing regulatory frameworks to the extent that they operate within their own and separate technical framework? And so this distinction between the rule of law and the rule of code is actually the most apparent in the context of property. So traditional property rights are defined by the law, and they can therefore also be taken away by the law. So if I acquire a particular piece of property in a way that turns out to be illegitimate, then a judge, a court order, can actually declare that I'm not the legitimate owner of that property and potentially take it away from me. Whereas when we move into those blockchain-based systems, then we encounter those new cryptographic assets or blockchain-based properties, which actually do not follow the same rules. Because the ownership of those assets is defined by the code rather than by the law, and therefore it can only be taken away by the code. And so if I legitimately acquire a Bitcoin, then regardless of what the law says, then no one can actually unilaterally intervene in order to take those Bitcoins away from me. And then the same applies in the context of contracts. So traditional legal contracts are created according to specific rules which are defined by contract law. And those are meant to actually create some kind of binding agreement between two parties. But those agreements can only be enforced through the intervention of a third-party authority, which needs to read and understand and interpret the actual wordings of the contract in order to then understand what was the original intent behind the contracting parties. And again, when we move into those blockchain-based systems, then we create those new type of contractual or technical arrangements, which are the so-called smart contracts. And those are actually defined only and exclusively by the code which has been deployed on the blockchain. And so those agreements do not actually require the intervention of any third-party authority for the enforcement, because the contractual provision will be automatically enforced by the technology itself, which of course is incapable of actually understanding the real intentionality of the parties, but will just look at the wording of the code. And so those characteristics actually mean that we can now create those kind of software entities on a blockchain in such a way that they can de facto act as autonomous agents. Because those agents can own property to the extent that this property can be defined as a particular token or has a representation on the blockchain. And they can also engage into a series of contractual relationships via those smart contracts. And then most importantly, even though those autonomous agents generally do not have any kind of intelligence, they're actually quite simple, so they do not have like decisional autonomy, in that they cannot take any decision on their own, they do actually benefit from a different kind of autonomy, which is the operational autonomy, in the sense that they can operate autonomously and independently of any third party. And so this leads us to the most exciting part of blockchain technology, at least in my view, which is the ability to create those new kind of algorithmical entities which can be regarded to some extent as a blockchain-based life form. Because they are autonomous, they are self-sufficient in the sense that they can collect all the resources that they need in order to sustain themselves. And of course, like any other kind of life form, they are also potentially capable of reproducing themselves. And so this might sound a little bit confusing at first, but to illustrate the concept, I've brought here this small prototype of a blockchain-based life form which you can interact with. And so this is a plantoid, which is the Android version of a plant, and this is my personal attempt at trying to show in the physical world what are the core functionality of a blockchain-based organization. And so how does this work exactly? So traditional plants, most of them at least, are incapable of reproducing themselves on their own, and they oftentimes rely on the help of third parties, like bees or butterflies, in order to help them in the reproduction process through the pollination. In the same way, plantoids are actually also incapable of reproducing themselves on their own, and they rely on the help of humans in order to support them through the reproduction process via the fact of donating some kind of capital to them in the form of cryptocurrencies. And so the important thing to understand about a plantoid is that it is made of two separate components. So one is the body of the plantoid, which is this mechanical sculpture that exists in the physical world. And the other one is the spirit or the soul of the plantoid, which actually exists as an Ethereum smart contract. And those two components interact with each other in order to bring the plantoid to life and obviously in order to help it reproduce. And so let's look at the different phases of the reproduction of a plantoid. So the first one is the capitalization phase. And this is when the plantoid will try to make itself as beautiful as possible in order to lure people into donating some cryptocurrencies to it. And so every plantoid has its own Bitcoin and Ethereum wallet that people can actually send funds to. And every time it receives some funds, then the plantoid will try and show some form of appreciation by doing some lights, or by doing music, or by doing a little dance. And so I can do a little demonstration here. I will feed this plantoid with a few Bitcoins. I have no internet. So I will not do a demonstration. That's a pity, but I think you have seen it reacting anyways. So normally it does some kind of rainbowish light show. And the thing is that the plantoid is constantly monitoring its blockchain balance. And then whenever it realizes that it has accumulated a sufficient amount of funds in order to reproduce itself, then this will trigger the smart contract on the Ethereum blockchain, which will start the second phase of reproduction, which is the mating phase. And this is when the plantoid will actually actively start to look for an individual, a person, that will actually support in the reproduction. And so this is done via the smart contract on the Ethereum blockchain that will essentially open a call inviting anyone, artists, designers, or whoever wants, to submit a proposition about how they actually envision to create the next version of the plantoids. And then all the people that have funded the plantoid can then vote on the proposition that they like the most, and their vote will be weighted with the amount of funds that they have sent in the first place. And then the smart contract will then process all that information and eventually will establish a winner. And this will trigger the third phase of reproduction, which is the hiring phase. And this is when the plantoid will then execute a blockchain transaction in order to transfer the funds that it has collected so far to the selected winner, who will then be hired by the plantoid in order to create a new copy of itself. And so here you can see the genealogical tree of the plantoid species. And so as you can see, this is plantoid number 6, which is the result of the reproduction of the genesis plantoid number 1. And so every plantoid actually needs to abide by the genetic criteria which have been encoded into the DNA of its parents. And so in the case of this plantoid, it needs to be made of chain, and its design needs to be released under a Creative Commons license as required by the Genesis plantoid 1. And then every artist that is creating a new plantoid can then add additional constraints into the DNA of the plantoid that they are producing. And so in the case of this plantoid, for instance, I have added the condition that whenever it is being fed, it needs to actually display this little rainbowish light show. And so we can see how this actually creates some kind of evolutionary algorithm where different plantoids will actually evolve into different species, each one with their own characteristics. And then the plantoids which are the most popular will be able to collect more cryptocurrencies and therefore will be able to reproduce themselves more. And the ones that are actually least appreciated will eventually fade into extinction. And so in the end, we will actually be able to find out which one of those plantoids are actually the most fit to their own environment. And those are the ones that actually reproduce the most and potentially start colonizing our planet. And actually, on that point, I'm actually very proud to announce that right now there are 9 plantoids, but there is 3 new plantoids that are being built, and they will soon go and colonize Black Rock City because they are going to Burning Man this year. And I'm also taking this as an opportunity that if anyone knows of anyone that will actually like to host any of those plantoids after Burning Man, please talk to me. I'm happy to give them away. Now, in addition to all this, of course, the plantoids are also not just like selfish creatures, but they also care about their own creators. And so every time a plantoid actually accumulates a sufficient amount of funds in order to reproduce itself, then it will send a small portion of those funds back to its parent, to the plantoid that actually generated it, and then another small portion of those funds will actually go to the creator, to the artist that actually produced the plantoid. And so this kind of pyramid scheme actually has 2 important benefits. The first one is that I created the Genesis plantoid, and so I currently stand at the top of this pyramid, and which is always great. I'm not getting that much money for now. But the other one, which is actually more important, is that it actually creates a positive incentive for every artist to create the most beautiful plantoid, because the more popular this plantoid will be, then the more they will be able to collect potential royalties. And then another important element of this is that this actually shifts the model of copyright around, in the sense that copyright law is based on the notion of scarcity and exclusivity, whereas here, every artist actually has an incentive to maximize the dissemination of its works, because the more visibility the plantoid gets, then the more money it will be able to collect, but also to encourage the making of remixes or derivative works in order to actually ensure that they can maximize the return on investment through the royalties. And then finally, most importantly, this actually shifts away the focus away from the artist and towards the art piece. And so instead of sending money to a variety of artists in the hopes that they will continue to produce works that we like, we can now fund directly the art piece itself, and then it is up to the art piece to decide and to select which one is the artist that should be entitled to reproduce it. And so now, of course, the plantoid is actually just one particular example of a particular kind of blockchain-based life form. But there are actually many other and many kinds of blockchain-based life form already out there. And so, in fact, most of the existing blockchain-based networks can themselves be regarded as a blockchain-based life form, although very precarious, in the sense that they are autonomous because they actually operate independently of any centralized authority. They are self-sufficient in the sense that they can actually sustain their own operation through the issuance of tokens to the miners. And of course, they are also capable of reproducing themselves into multiple species or breeds. And then there is also a variety of new blockchain-based life forms which are being built on top of existing blockchain-based networks. And those are the so-called decentralized application or decentralized autonomous organization, which also implement their own token system in order to fund or to sustain their operation, and which are also possibly capable of forking and reproducing themselves. And then finally, there are also the more advanced type of blockchain-based life forms which actually instantiate themselves into the physical world. And so this is, of course, the case of the plantoids, but there are also a variety of other initiatives which are actually experimenting with that. So, for instance, the example of Tira0, which is using a blockchain in order to help forests sell their own trees, and then use the money that they have collected in order to purchase their own land, in order to then emancipate themselves from their owners. And then there is also the more futuristic idea of the self-driving car that actually owns itself, and then the car can collect money when it's providing some rides to people, and then use this money in order to purchase some gas or electricity, or potentially in order to pay people to repair or to upgrade itself if it has accumulated sufficient funds to do so. And then, of course, you might wonder, then, why limit ourselves to autonomous cars when we could actually create autonomous agents which are collecting money for the services that they provide to society, and then use this money in order to feed themselves with electricity, or perhaps in order to pay people to work for them, and eventually, one day, perhaps also in order to reproduce themselves, just like this plantoid does. And so, to conclude, I will say that this is, of course, still a little bit into the field of science fiction, but those opportunities are actually started to become real, as demonstrated by this little plantoid here. And I would actually be very happy to see that more and more experimentation, probably coming from the artistic realm, because this is the only place in which it makes sense at the moment, in order to try and explore how we could actually experiment and create new blockchain-based life forms. Thank you.